Have you ever, like, stopped to think about if the language you speak, like, actually shapes how you think about the world?
It really is kind of a mind-blowing idea.
Yeah, it's a big question.
It is. It's a question that has fascinated, like anthropologists and linguists for centuries, really.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we're going to be diving into today.
That's right.
This idea of whether different languages actually influence how we understand knowledge itself.
Exact.
We're talking about linguistic relativity, right?
Yeah, yeah. Also called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. And it suggests that the structure of a language can influence the way its speakers perceive and conceptualize the world.
Which is kind of a crazy idea to wrap your head around.
Absolutely. It sparked a lot of debate over the years.
Because it's like, are we trapped inside this bubble of our language, or,
Right.
can our thoughts break free?
Exactly. And to kind of really understand the nuances of this debate, it's helpful to start with one of the pioneers in this field,
Okay.
Benjamin Lee Whorf, an American linguist, who studied Hopi, among other languages. And he made some pretty bold claims about how the Hopi people have a fundamentally different understanding of time than, say, speakers of English.
Whoa, hold on. A different understanding of time.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So Whorf argued that the Hopi language doesn't conceptualize time as a linear progression, with past, present, and future kind of laid out like points on a timeline.
Okay.
Instead, their language focuses on the validity and duration of events, rather than sort of when they occurred on a timeline.
Interesting. So, like, give me an example. How would a Hopi speaker describe something that happened yesterday?
Instead of saying, I went for a walk yesterday, they might say something closer to, I went for a walk and this event is reported. The emphasis is on the act of reporting the event as valid without explicitly placing it in the past.
Okay, so it's not about, like, when it happened,
Right.
but that it's a valid thing that, like, occurred.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It makes you wonder if maybe our perception of time as this linear progression
Yeah.
is just like, a product of how we talk about it,
Right.
not necessarily an objective truth about how the universe works.
It really makes you question
Yeah.
what we take for granted.
Yeah, exactly. And how much of, the way we think about things is shaped by just the words that we happen to use.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, how solid is Worf's research?
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard there's been some pushback on his ideas.
Yeah, you're right to be cautious. While Whorf's work is super fascinating,
Yeah.
it's also been criticized for being, somewhat speculative and lacking strong evidence.
Okay.
Some linguists and anthropologists argue that his interpretations of Hopi were flawed and that his broader claims about linguistic relativity were overreaching.
So where does that leave us?
Right.
Is there any evidence to support this idea that language shapes thought?
Well, there's another perspective we need to consider here, which is the Boas-Jacobson principle. And essentially it argues that any thought can be expressed in any language.
Okay.
Human thought processes are universal, even if the way we express those thoughts differs.
Okay, so it's more about like how we express our thoughts
Yeah,
than the thoughts themselves.
that's the gist of it. The Boas-Jacobson principle suggests that language differences are more superficial than they appear. So while languages may differ in, their grammatical structures or vocabulary,
Yeah.
this doesn't necessarily mean that their speakers have fundamentally different ways of thinking.
I see. So we need to like look beyond just grammatical differences
Right.
and really dig into specific examples to see where language might actually be influencing our thinking about the world.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one fascinating example is the Guugu Yimithirr language,
Okay.
spoken by an Aboriginal Australian group.
Okay.
And their language doesn't use words like left, right, front, or back to describe locations. Instead, they use cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, almost exclusively.
Wait, so even if they're just describing something in a room,
Yes.
they would say like the cup is to the north of the plate.
Precisely. It's completely ingrained in their language.
Yeah.
And studies have shown that this constant awareness of geographic directions leads to an incredibly sharp sense of spatial awareness.
Really?
Yeah. Guugu Yimithirr speakers can mentally map out their surroundings with remarkable accuracy, even in unfamiliar environments.
That's amazing. It's like their language is training their brains to think differently about space from a very young age.
It is.
It makes you wonder what other cognitive abilities might be influenced by the language we speak.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these examples from Hopyis and Guugu Yimithirr.
Right.
What other languages show this potential link between language and thought?
Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about languages that have grammatical gender.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with this if you've studied languages like Spanish, French, or German.
Yeah, where even inanimate objects have a gender.
Ver-
Like in Spanish, a table is la mesa, feminine,
Mm-hmm.
but a book is el libro, masculine.
Right.
It always seemed kind of random to me.
It can seem that way,
Yeah.
but there's a fascinating study where researchers asked German and Spanish speakers to describe various objects, but they had them do it in English.
Interesting. So they weren't actually hearing
Right.
or using those gendered nouns in their native languages during this study.
Right.
How did the researchers make sure that their native languages weren't influencing their descriptions?
That was the clever part. By having them speak English, they could isolate the potential influence of grammatical gender, and the results were striking.
Okay.
German speakers consistently described bridges, which are grammatically feminine in German, with adjectives like elegant, fragile, pretty, while Spanish speakers, for whom bridge is masculine, used words like strong, sturdy, towering.
Wow, that's wild. Even when they were speaking English, their native language's grammatical gender was subtly shaping their perceptions. It makes you wonder if even seemingly arbitrary grammatical rules can have a real impact on how we think about the world.
Exactly. And this leads us to another intriguing example, that Japanese traffic lights.
Oh, yeah.
You might have heard the story about how they had to change the green light to a bluer shade because of the language itself.
I think I vaguely remember that. Refresh my memory. What happened?
So in Japanese, the word ao traditionally referred to both blue and green. While there is a separate word for green, midori, it wasn't commonly used for the green traffic light.
Okay.
But this caused some confusion, especially for people who weren't native Japanese speakers.
So they actually redesigned a physical object, the traffic light, to better match the categories of their language.
That's fascinating.
That's pretty compelling evidence that language can shape how we perceive the world.
Absolutely.
Literally.
Literally.
It makes sense, like when you think about like colorblindness and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like...
It's a different kind of...
Yeah, it's a cultural
colorblindness, almost. It really highlights the power of these linguistic categories.
For sure.
And this gets to a broader point about color perception.
Okay.
Some researchers believe that the way a language divides the color spectrum can influence how its speakers categorize and perceive subtle color differences.
That makes sense. I remember reading that some languages don't have separate words for blue and green, and their speakers have a harder time distinguishing those colors.
Right.
So you're saying that having those distinct words for colors might actually make us more sensitive to those differences.
That's the hypothesis. Of course, there are universal aspects of color perception, shaped by the biology of our visual system.
Of course.
But cultural factors, including language, seem to play a significant role in how we label and categorize those colors.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It makes you think about all the different ways that people might experience the world.
Yeah.
Depending on the language they speak. This makes me think about, like, the idea that simpler societies have simpler languages.
Right.
Is there any truth to that?
That's a misconception that thankfully has been debunked. The idea that hunter-gatherer groups, for example, have primitive languages is simply not true. Every language, regardless of the culture it comes from, has its own intricate complexities.
I'm glad to hear that. It always seemed a bit ethnocentric to assume that some languages are inherently simpler or more complex than others.
It is, yeah.
So if it's not about overall complexity,
Yeah.
what is it about language that might affect our thinking?
One area where language might have a particularly strong influence is in our understanding of abstract concepts. And to kind of delve into that, we need to talk about the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson.
Oh, yes.
Two cognitive linguists who revolutionized how we think about metaphor.
Metaphors we live by, yeah.
Exactly.
I love that book.
They argue that we understand abstract ideas through metaphors based on our concrete experiences, right? They claim that our conceptual system isn't just literal. It's fundamentally metaphorical.
Okay.
We grasp abstract concepts by relating them to more concrete experiences.
And that these metaphors are embedded in our language, right?
Exactly.
Shaping how we think and talk about those concepts.
Precisely.
Okay.
Take the metaphor. Argument is war.
Okay.
We use warlike language to talk about arguments.
Yeah.
We attack someone's position.
Right.
We defend our own ideas, try to win the debate.
Yeah, for sure.
These aren't just fancy literary devices.
Right.
Lakoff and Johnson argue that these metaphors actually structure our thinking.
So the argument is war metaphor could make us approach arguments more aggressively,
Potentially. Yeah.
focused on defeating our opponent
Right.
rather than finding common ground or something like that.
Can shape our approach.
That's a powerful example of how a metaphor encoded in our language could actually shape our behavior.
Absolutely. And Lakoff and Johnson suggest that many of our most basic metaphors are grounded in our physical experiences.
Okay.
Things like spatial orientations, our interactions with objects, and basic bodily sensations.
So like the concept of happy being up and sad being down.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we physically lift our heads when we're happy and slump when we're sad.
That's a great example, yeah.
Okay.
These physical experiences become the foundation for more abstract metaphors,
Yeah,
which then get woven into the fabric of our language,
for sure.
and by extension, our thinking.
Yeah. That's why it's almost like our bodies are shaping how we think
In a way, yeah.
through language.
Through language.
That's so cool.
It is pretty amazing.
So we've explored how language might shape our understanding of time, space, objects, colors, and even abstract concepts like arguments.
Yeah.
It seems like language really does have a pretty big influence on how we think.
I think it's safe to say that while there's no definitive proof that language completely determines thought, there's growing evidence that it plays a significant role.
It's like you said earlier,
Yeah.
different languages highlight certain aspects of reality
Right.
while downplaying others.
Exactly.
And those subtle nudges can have a real impact on how we categorize information, make judgments, and even experience the world around us.
Exactly. It's not that our language creates an impenetrable box around our thinking,
Right.
but it definitely provides a framework, a lens through which we view the world.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for us? Should we all go out and learn a bunch of different languages to break free from these linguistic constraints?
Learning new languages can certainly broaden your perspective
Yeah.
and make you more aware of the assumptions embedded in your own language.
Right.
But even without becoming polyglots, I think the key takeaway here is cultivating awareness.
Awareness of how our own language might be shaping our thoughts without us even realizing it.
Exactly. Recognizing that the way we express ourselves is just one of many possible ways of understanding the world. We can learn to question our assumptions and be more open to different perspectives.
So maybe instead of asking, does language completely determine thought?
Right.
The real question is, how does language influence our thinking?
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing those subtle influences and appreciating the incredible diversity of human languages and the ways of thinking they represent.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
Yes.
I'm curious, before we wrap up, is there anything else about this topic that you find particularly interesting or thought-provoking?
Well, if language can subtly shape our understanding of something as fundamental as time,
Yeah.
what other hidden influences might be lurking in the way we speak and think? For example, could our digital communication styles, with their emojis and abbreviations,
Right.
be shaping a new generation's cognitive processes in ways we haven't even begun to imagine?
That's a really intriguing question.
It is.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of understanding this complex relationship between language and thought.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this such a captivating field of study.
Yeah.
There's always more to explore, more to learn about the intricate ways language shapes our understanding of the world.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of language and thought.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. I know I'll never look at language the same way again.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about languages that have grammatical gender.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with this if you've studied languages like Spanish